after lunch or any longer than you have to, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started, if you all don't mind. I think I have to be back there to flip the presentation, so I may have to stand behind the microphone at some point. But for those of you I haven't met before, I'm Chris Nida with the North Carolina League of Municipalities. I'm the Director of Research and Policy Analysis, which we have lots of long and convoluted titles at the League. But I work on our public and government affairs team. I manage some of the surveys we do. I do a lot of analysis of legislation, especially when it comes to fiscal bills that deal with your revenues. So you'll probably hear sort of a finance-directed presentation from me today. Many of you may have seen Ryan Drawn, our IT director, here before. He asked me to fill in for him today. I can't remember what his excuse was a couple months ago when he asked me, but I'm happy to get out of Raleigh and come down to Wilmington for the day. Stacy Hypes is on our staff now too. I don't know how many of you knew Stacy, but she told me to tell everybody hello. I got an email from her about something with the website while I was on the road this morning, but she was sad to miss all of you. So just for my benefit, how many folks in here are from city governments? And how many county people do we have? Does anybody not fall into either of those buckets? State? Okay. Okay, 12. Okay. Well, I'm going to focus mainly on the city side of things. I got a few county items in there as well that I picked up from our friends at the county commissioners. But I'll try to answer any questions that you have about anything. I have my presentation put together, so I'm going to run through that. Is there anything in particular, or any issue that you're interested in that I can try to cover or answer anything on before we get to the, I'm sure there'll be time at the end for questions and discussion. Is there anything you're aware of that you really want to talk about? Perfect. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity, and I'll jump right into the presentation. I think this microphone is on. Can you also hear me around back here? Okay. Like I said, start with kind of an overview of the legislative session. Talk about municipal issues. I do have some county, and if you have any state issues that we may have been following along with, I'm happy to try to answer questions about that as well, and then hopefully have some time for questions and discussion at the end. I think we have until 2:15 with this session, but may not even need all of that. It just depends. So, 2016 overview. I don't know how familiar all of y'all are with the legislative process. I don't want to bore you by telling you stuff you already know. They operate in a 2-year biennium. So the odd number of years are what's considered the long session. They come in January and can take up any bill that they want to, and are usually there until the fiscal year, hopefully. They pass the budget by July 1st and then get out of town. Last year they were here. I think they may have adjourned on September 30th, or if not, it was the first week of October. It was one of the longest long sessions that we had in some time. So 2016 is supposed to be the short session, quote unquote. They usually come back in May. They came back a little bit earlier this year, April 25th. And theoretically, they're supposed to pass a budget and get out of town. And so far, they've actually done that. I didn't double check this morning, but as far as I know, the House gave final approval to its budget this morning, so it's out of the House and on over to the Senate. And the Senate's talking about getting to work on the budget next week and maybe having something within a couple weeks. If that's the case, they'll certainly have some issues to fight out among the two of them before passing a final budget. But if they were to get a budget passed by the middle of June, I shouldn't even say anything out loud because, I mean, between everybody in the room, I would just like them to go home as soon as possible. If they could get a budget passed by mid-June, that would be one of the earliest adjournments in the 8 or so years that I've been following this, and so that would be something to be very optimistic about. But they came back April 25th. 2016 is, of course, an election year. You know, from the way that the districts are drawn and just sort of kind of the demographics of the state, we think about it being an election year and then wanting to get home and go raise money and run for re-election. The primary that we had in March ended up determining almost half of the legislative races. So 43% of the 170 Senate and House races in the state are already decided. So we know who's coming back to that seat next year. There's no general election opponent. There's another good handful of them that have sort of token opposition in the fall, but just based on voter makeup, it's really not going to be a competitive district. So it is an election year, but you know, the potential seats that are up for grabs in the legislature, it probably comes down to, I mean, maybe 15 or 20, just depending on how voter turnout and different things go this year. So you don't have as much of the impetus maybe to get home and campaign for re-election as there has been in some short sessions in the past. We do have a primary coming up on June 7th. Because of the way, you know, the voting districts were challenged in federal courts and overturned and had to be redrawn. I don't know how many of you all followed that in the papers, but we have a congressional primary for a few districts in the middle of a legislative session where legislators, the way it worked out, you can run for Congress, and if you lose, you can just go back to your legislative seat that you already won election for. So we have 6 or 7 state legislators who are running for U.S. Congress. Some of them might win. This is, you know, kind of getting in the weeds. It may or may not be interesting to you. The other part about having a primary on June 7th is that there's not going to be any runoff. So it's just the top vote getter is going to be the next congressman from that, or congressperson, I should say, from that district. So there's a seat, District 12, down near kind of Iredell, Davie County, that area, where I think you have 12, I want to say it's 12 Republicans running for the seat, something along those lines. And the top vote getter is going to be the next congressman from that congressperson from that district. So you could have somebody who gets just 10% of the vote, 11% of the vote or something, but if it's the most out of those 12 candidates, they're going to be serving in Congress come next year. So I sort of digressed there a little bit about the congressional election, but it could be a factor for some legislators who are more worried in kind of getting their name out there for a congressional race than worrying about things at the state level for the time being. From a budget perspective, the revenues at the state level are actually doing very well. They're more than $300 million ahead of where they had projected to be at this time. So we have a budget surplus that they're working on spending. The reason we have a budget surplus is because income tax collections are higher than they thought they were going to be, which is offsetting the fact that sales tax revenue is actually a little bit lower than they expected it to be. The economy's slowing down from a sales tax perspective, which of course from the local government side of things, we don't get any of the income tax, but we do get a pretty good chunk of our revenues from sales tax. So some of your finance and budget folks, and when you guys are putting your budgets together at the local level, probably being a little bit more conservative on the sales tax and revenue front than they have been for the past several years. Key issues, I'm going to, even though I'd like to avoid it as much as possible, I'm going to talk about House Bill 2 just a little bit. They're also, you know, the budget surplus and how the House and Senate choose to spend it in their budgets, whether they put that toward more tax cuts or teacher pay or state employee pay or whatever. I think that's going to be an overriding issue for 2016. And again, just some of these election issues playing themselves out in legislation at the state level. But in terms of municipal issues, I do sort of have to start just from a kind of a political and climate perspective with House Bill 2. I'm sure it's been impossible to avoid the past month or two, however long this has been going on since the city of Charlotte passed its ordinance. That was in, I want to say late February, early March. It's all kind of run together for me. But the legislators called a special session on March 23rd to address Charlotte's ordinance at a state level. They were, of course, expanded some LGBT protections. There's a bathroom issue involved that has become a major source of discussion. And so the legislators felt like they had to come back on March 23rd for a one-day session to address what has been characterized by some at least as overreach at the city level, city government overstepping its boundaries. And so they were back for 12 hours and passed a bill that not only addressed this public accommodation, this public restroom issue, but also overrode a lot of local anti-discrimination ordinances, provided that you can only sue for anti-discrimination complaints in federal court, you can no longer sue in state court, and established a minimum wage standard for private sector employers, made sure that no cities could have a living wage or their own minimum wage ordinance. That all happened, like I said, in the span of 12 hours. I think they came in that morning and the bill was passed and had been signed by the governor by 7 p.m. that evening. So of course we've had a lot of discussion and a lot of legal wrangling over that. There was a Fourth Circuit Court that ruled in favor in Virginia that would seem to be a ruling in opposition to the state's law. The state and federal government have now sued each other over whether the bill violates federal law and could jeopardize a lot of federal funding for North Carolina. I'm not a lawyer, so I always leave all the
you know, the mechanics of which court and which circuit and that sort of thing to our legal staff. I mainly bring this up because to the extent that the city of Charlotte is getting blamed for putting North Carolina into this mess, that legislators want to say, you know, we would have never been in this position if the city of Charlotte hadn't overstepped its boundaries. That's, for city governments, that's going to play into the attitude that legislators have toward us and the issues that we're able to work on this session. So we've been really diligent keeping our eyes out for, you know, retaliatory bills, things that might try to take additional power, additional revenue away from cities. It's not a great, it hasn't been a great political climate for local governments for the past several years, just because of some disagreements in philosophy among the legislative majority and local government advocates. But particularly with this, I think, you know, this is not the League of Municipalities characterization, but Chris Nida, you know, just saying, I think as much as possible, we're going to need to keep our head down this legislative session and try to let them do their business and get out of town and then continue to work on that relationship heading into 2017. So that's sort of kind of the overarching mood or overarching issue that is having an effect on everything. Like I mentioned, the House passed its budget. I assume they gave final approval to it this morning. It passed last night by a vote of 103 to 12, which is pretty significant bipartisanship for this legislature recently. It grows state spending by approximately 2.3%, which I think is below inflation. It provides raises for teachers and state employees and a COLA for state retirees. And it phases in a $2,000 raise of the standard income tax deduction. So that would be a tax cut for those taxpayers that take that standard deduction. From a city perspective, it maintains our current level of POW bill funding. That's the money that cities and towns get for street maintenance and street repair. It keeps that at $147.5 million, so we definitely appreciate legislators keeping that funding stream going and thank them for that. There was I don't know if anybody here is from Orange County or Durham County, but there was something put in just at the end of the last legislative session that would have capped state funding for light rail projects at $500,000. Durham and Chapel Hill have an ongoing light rail project to connect the two communities that the state was set to contribute. I think the number is $137 million that the state is going to put in. So if you cap the state funding at $500,000, that essentially kills that project and makes it completely unviable. The House budget would repeal that cap, which we think is good news for that project and for cities generally. And just another provision I noted was that it directs the North Carolina Justice Academy to develop social media training for law enforcement officers. It's supposed to be available online to all law enforcement officers around the state. I did reach out to our friends at the County Association to talk to them about what they saw in the budget that might be of interest. There continues to be some discussion about lottery receipts and how they're used. Those lottery receipts were supposed to be used to fund school construction. It transfers some lottery money to fund administrative employees in schools. And I know it keeps it lottery money for school construction at $100 million, which I think when the lottery was instituted, counties were supposed to get 40% of lottery proceeds to put towards school construction. I'm not sure that that's ever been fully funded. $100 million represents about 16% of the lottery proceeds. So it keeps it at that 16% level. Did note something in the IT portion about a special provision that's going to create an enterprise system for state agencies and community colleges. So I don't have a whole lot of detail on that, but that'll be something new coming to the state and community college if that holds in the House budget. But the budget now, of course, has to go over to the Senate. They'll put out their own version of the budget with different spending priorities, and then they'll come back to try to reach agreement, hopefully as soon as possible. All right, I told you I would talk about finance and budget bills a little bit just because that's my area of specialty, and I'll try not to go too deep into the weeds on you, but this might give you some idea of the revenue pressures when you see your budget being presented or working with budget officers. We had a lot of discussion last session about sales tax reallocation, about whether sales tax money from urban and tourist communities was going to be shifted to the more rural areas of the state in order to kind of help them with some of their rural needs. We have another bill filed this year, Senate Bill 846, which I got a lot of questions about this week. It's really kind of nuanced what it does, but the bottom line is that it makes some changes in the sales tax statutes that are going to raise some of the issues that we saw last session. taking money away from some counties and giving it to other counties and municipalities. So I think I sent something out this week that got a lot of your local finance officers and budget officers about some estimates on what this bill might do. Bottom line, the League of Municipalities, we continue to push for solutions and revenue options that benefit everybody so that we're not taking money from one group and sending it to another group to benefit somebody. So we're going to continue to work on that and hopefully work on this bill so that we don't have any counties and municipalities losing sales tax revenue as a result. Municipal service districts, I don't know how many of you have municipal service districts in your community. A lot of these are in downtown areas where there's a special taxing district where you levy a little bit extra property tax that goes to pay for extra services like downtown revitalization or sidewalk cleaning or whatever it might be. There was a push last session to allow property owners to remove themselves from a municipal service district. So if you didn't want to pay the extra property tax, you would just be able to petition and remove yourself from that district. You know, if you take this to its sort of absurd extreme, it's sort of like a property taxpayer in your county or city saying, hey, I don't have any kids that are in public schools. I think I'm just not going to pay the portion of the property tax that goes to fund schools. Or I don't throw away as much trash as my neighbor, so I'm going to pay a little bit less in terms of what in my solid waste fee, whatever it might be. This was, of course, just municipal service district specific, but we thought it was a bad precedent. It would certainly hurt this municipal service district authority. The compromise bill, after some work over the interim that came out, is going to allow owners to petition for removal, at which point a city council has to have a public hearing and determine whether there's a valid reason to remove the person from the district, but the power still lies with the city council to make the final decision as to whether that property owner stays in the district or not, which is a compromise that I think we can live with. County tier system, there's been I don't know how many of you are familiar with the process the Department of Commerce goes through every year to determine what are the most economically distressed and economically prosperous counties in the state, divide them up into 3 tiers based on those levels. And then those tiers determine a lot of grants that you're eligible for, certain funding streams, loan programs that are only eligible to those in lower counties. There was a lot of discussion between legislative sessions this year about whether the tier system was an appropriate way to categorize economic distress, whether there's a better way to do that. So we have a couple bills that would change the way the tiers are determined. The second one there, starts with House Bill 1028, would actually replace the current tier system with a new program. After a lot of study, the first bill would just authorize further study of the issue, create an 11-person work group. So we had months of discussion to come up with a plan for even more discussion. So I think whatever happens with these bills, there's probably some changes to the tiers coming at some point down the road, although nobody knows exactly what those changes are going to look like at this point. Body-worn cameras, I know that's another issue that there's a lot of talk in the interim about body-worn cameras. There was some funding, I believe, in the state budget last year for a grant program for local governments to purchase body-worn cameras for their offices. And then there was a study committee in between these 2 legislative sessions that we worked on quite a bit. So what came out of that study committee was House Bill 972, which is titled Body-Worn and Dashboard Cameras, No Public Record. It addressed some of the public record issues related to body-worn cameras, clarifying that they are not public records, although it grants the head law enforcement official in any local community to determine if a recording should be released or redeemed as a personnel record, and it gives them criteria that they can consider when they're considering whether to disclose a camera recording. There's a minimum for record retention, and then I also noted that there was a requirement that local law enforcement agencies share any software required to operate your camera recordings with the SBI and the North Carolina State Crime Laboratory. You all can probably know better than me whether that's an onerous requirement or whether that's something you would be able to comply with. We were talking before the session here about some particulars in terms of data storage and where that's going to be stored at the state level, and making sure that it's still classified as a local record, even if it might be stored at a state facility. So the police chiefs, the sheriffs, there have been a lot of groups. I think they've done a really thorough study of this issue, and I think everybody is satisfied with where they've come down. But if you all see any other additional issues or know of anything locally that needs to be addressed, please let me know, because we're happy to share that. I mentioned some of those bills that may or may not be in retaliation for some of the problems that cities have caused. I think you could potentially consider that as one of the motivations for Senate Bill 868, which is titled Local Government Immigration Compliance. It targets so-called sanctuary cities where cities that maybe at least are classified as not following federal law. I'm again not an expert on federal immigration law. I think the expectation of cities is that anytime you pull somebody over, or anybody's involved in a call with the police, that you also ask about their immigration status at that time, and if it's determined that they're not in compliance with immigration laws, detain them and wait for the federal government to get involved. This bill would set up a process where the Attorney General, if there's a complaint from any interested party, as far as I can tell, that a city is not following immigration laws, then the Attorney General can investigate this complaint, and if the Attorney General determines that a city is not in compliance with immigration laws, or a county is not in compliance with immigration laws, it can hold back some of their funding streams. For cities, it would be that PALGO money, that transportation funding that they could hold back. For counties, it would be capital funding for schools. So it gives a lot of power to the Attorney General in terms of investigating this and making that determination. One of the sponsors of the bill is Senator Buck Newton. He's running for Attorney General this fall. So that's just another sort of nuance to this, but it's another bill that's making its way through the Senate. Annexation hasn't been such an issue for us the last couple of years since it was basically settled in 2012, but we do have a couple of local de-annexations where the legislature has filed bills to remove a portion of a town without the city's request. Always concerning when you have these areas of a municipality where there's services have been provided and the government has worked with the property owners, and then the legislature comes in and just removes these parcels from town. These are local bills, but we tend to try to track them just because of the precedent involved of legislators in Raleigh determining city boundaries and property ownership in a municipality. PSAPs, I don't know how many of you operate primary public safety answering points or secondary public safety answering points in that, the 911 call centers. There was a requirement maybe 2 years ago, I want to say, that every PSAP must have a backup plan in place in the case of service failure, I guess I'll say. We have got that requirement dialed back. Originally, there was going to have to be a backup facility built for every PSAP. It now says in the law that you have to have backup capability, which doesn't necessarily have to be a new facility. And they pushed the deadline for having those backup plans in place out. I believe the deadline is now July 1st, 2017, although the 911 board says that you have to have made substantial progress on your backup plan by July 1st, 2016. The 911 board, yes, sir.
Is there a published document that describes substantial progress?
I don't believe so. That's the bullet 2 is what I was getting to. As far as I know, substantial progress is at the discretion of the 911 board, and I'm not aware. I'll double check with the lobbyist on our staff who deals with these issues. I don't believe that there's any kind of guidelines or criteria as to what constitutes substantial progress, at least that I'm aware of. And the 911 board came out in one of the recent meetings and said that basically that they're not going to have enough funds to cover all the costs of implementing these backup plans, and so that you shouldn't expect to rely on the 911 board for these funds, and should expect to use some of your own general fund dollars yourself to implement these plans. So I know the counties have worked with some of their legislators. We've worked with legislators as well on this substantial progress issue and making sure that it's something realistic that all of our governments that are operating PSAPs can comply with. Iran divestment. This came up as a big issue for finance officers and purchasing officers. I don't know how many of you have involvement with that at the local level. This came up earlier this spring. There was a law passed last year that the state and no political subdivision of the state, which includes cities and counties, can do business with any entity that's on a list that the state treasurer puts out of businesses that do $20 million worth of business with Iran. And the threshold for that contract, that attestment, was $1,000. And so what I had people describing to me was a situation where a finance officer might sign a catering contract for $1,500 with a local caterer, but in order for that contract to be valid, they have to go back to the caterer and get them to attest that they are not doing $20 million worth of business with the country of Iran. it's not a, it's not a huge issue in terms of kind of authority or revenue. It's more of just an administrative kind of government efficiency, whether we're creating an unnecessary bureaucratic step and potentially invalidating some valid contracts because we don't have this kind of formal attestment as to whether or not somebody does business with Iran. So we're attempting to get some changes with that on the state level, just to ease the administrative burden on local governments. Local borrowing, this is something, a bill hasn't been filed on this yet, but we saw some bills toward the end of last session that would have put restrictions on the local government commission as to when they can and can't approve debt, and would have allowed certain cities and counties not to be able to get debt approved under certain circumstances. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the local government commission that approves most debt at the local level, but I think most people agree that one of the reasons we have a lot of financially sound counties and cities and don't have, municipal and county bankruptcy problems that you see in other areas of the country is that we have a local government commission that is exercising some oversight. And so anytime we see legislative involvement in that oversight and trying to dictate what the LGC can and can't do, we get interested in that and want to push back on that. So we haven't seen that yet, although we were told that there was going to be more bills in that regard coming this session, so we have our eyes out for that. Retirement system, I imagine most, if not all of you, are in the state or local government retirement system. There were a lot of rumors last session about a bill that would have changed the nature of the pension system. Right now we're in a defined benefit plan where your pension is determined by the amount of time you work and the highest 4 years of your salary and your age and years of service at retirement. There was a lot of talk that they were going to try to move the state pension system to something more like a private 401k, where it would just be based on the amount of money you put into it. Nobody ever saw this legislation, as far as I know, although we've heard rumors that it was drafted and ready to go. But don't necessarily expect that to come up again this year, but just something else to be aware of. We always try to track these pension issues going forward. Billboards, a lot of talk last. Yes, sir. Sorry.
Was that a certain person, or was that a group of legislators who were looking at that? Do you know? Or would you be willing to share it if you did know?
Those are two separate questions. I don't know if it was, I honestly don't think it was any particular legislator. You see these outside advocacy groups that issue reports about these kind of things and about pension failures in other states. So, I mean, you can point to some of the, I don't want to call them the usual suspects, but, some of the folk, there have been people that have had a lot of discussion about the pension system and failures in other states. Our pension system, particularly the local system, but even the state systems, are both over 90% funded, one of the best run pension systems anywhere in the country. And if you talk to the people about the pension system, shifting to a defined contribution plan wouldn't even save them any money, because of the way the pension system is so well funded now that there's no savings associated with that. So, I mean, I think if a change were made, it would be really mostly on the basis of philosophy and not for any kind of cost savings at the state level. Did I evade your question sufficiently?
Yes, that was excellent. Thanks.
Billboards, some legislation last year that we thought might come up again this year about removing municipal regulatory authority over billboards. Basically would have made it impossible to ever replace a billboard or get it, would have allowed for the replacement of standard billboards with electronic billboards with basically no municipal oversight, deals with clear cutting of trees around billboard sites. Like I said, the bill was filed and then get into hearings last year. We thought it might come up again this year. So far, we haven't seen anything, but still have our eye out on that. Aesthetics is another issue. Municipal authority to regulate what new development looks like. That was pretty well dialed back last year. We might see some even further restriction on that based on some things that are going around the state. That is my last slide. This is a list of our upcoming events, some of which have already happened. Hopefully some of your officials will be in Raleigh on June 8th for Town Hall Day, and back in Raleigh in October for our annual conference. For those county folks in the room, the three priority issues that the counties are working on this year is to make taxing authority for all counties equivalent across the state, so that if one county has a taxing authority for something, any county has a taxing authority for that. There's a additional quarter-cent, or maybe half-cent sales tax currently in statute that counties can put to a referendum to benefit school construction or whatever the specific project might be. I think the counties want all counties to have the authority to put that up for a referendum and to be used for general purpose so that it didn't necessarily have to be tied to a specific area. Counties are also looking for the authority to lay broadband line, not the ability to operate broadband as a government, because that's been a really controversial issue that's been drawn some attention at the federal level, but I think to help expand broadband coverage in their areas, particularly in more rural areas, so the county can help fund getting the broadband actually in the ground and then bring a private company in to run the system, although I think the private companies still have some concern that this is maybe a foot in the door toward government-run broadband systems. And finally, I know the third priority issue for the counties is preventing school boards from being able to sue county governments over their budget appropriation for school funding. I know we've had some pretty contentious lawsuits around the state, and they would like to see that authority eliminated. So those are the three big issues they are going to be working on. I know I'm fairly well short on time at this point. Those are the issues that, like I said, I should knock on wood, and I shouldn't even say this out loud, but I mean, so far, they have done the budget, and it's been relatively quiet with what else is going on at the General Assembly, so I'm sure there will be other bills that move and come up in the next few weeks, a couple months, but those are the ones that we have really highlighted as significant issues to governments. Are there any issues, legislative or non-legislative, that I can hit, ma'am?
Last session, or there was a bill passed, House Bill 97, I wrote it down.
House Bill 97 was the budget, and there was a
Yeah.
lot of non-budgetary things in the budget last year.
Oh, okay,
special
well then,
provisions.
the rest of it was A18, and it has to do with linking your budget on your website,
Oh.
open data.
Yeah,
But, I mean, whatever came with that, because that's impossible for us to do as a small entity.
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Right, part of the budget last year, so I apologize, this is a long-winded way of answering your question. The House budget was like 300 pages last year, something like that. The Senate budget was something like 490 pages. And it's not like there was a bunch of additional spending in the Senate budget. The Senate budget had a lot of what we would consider policy provisions in it, so non-budgetary items put into the budget. And I think from our perspective, this Budgetary Transparency Act that you're referring to was one of those sort of, doesn't really have to do with state spending necessarily, but it is in the budget and is in law nonetheless. And so what the provision says, if I'm remembering it correctly, is that by April 1st this year, the state CIO and the Office of State Budget Management were supposed to facilitate every local government and school board in the state, every municipality, every county, providing their budgetary data to the state down to the vendor level, like the line item vendor level, and having the state compile all that into one database where you can compare spending between government units and have a searchable, comparable database up and running by April 1st. And I think with state funding of something like, I can't remember the number, I mean, it was like $500,000 or something that was not sufficient for what they were requiring. And it was going to require that you put the same thing on your website. So budgetary and spending data down to the vendor level and then updated monthly. That's still in law, that's still there. The local government commission was one of the agencies at the state level that was supposed to manage it, and they managed this, and they came out with guidance before the April 1st deadline that said that they didn't think that local governments needed to take any new action as a result of this law. That from their perspective, they would use available state and local budget data to put together the state transparency website at the state level, and that local governments do not need to take any new action or put anything new on their websites as a result of this law. Yes, sir?
And just to tack on to that, I emailed the state CIO, and the next day I had an email from the Office of Budget and Management, and they pretty much said, don't do anything at this time.
Can you share that on the
Sure.
list?
Sure.
So I can tell my managers and
Sure thing.
Yeah, I mean, for
And
my,
that's just been within the last, probably, well, when we got into our budget process, so probably in the May, probably end of April timeframe, that's when I got that. Yeah,
That'd be great, thanks.
yeah, sure thing.
let me get this thought out because I'll forget it. As a non-lawyer, I'm sort of treading on a tricky ground when I give you my legal interpretation of what the statute says. But the way it was worded was that the state CIO and the Office of State Budget and Management have to facilitate this process for local governments, facilitate the provision of data, and facilitate this posting at the local level. So by my reading of that law, if the state, if this is the guidance the state is giving and they're not providing any kind of facilitation at the local level, then you're okay to not be taking any new action as a result of this. But I mean, you're right. It was, I mean, I think it was very quickly determined by the people that were actually supposed to implement this, that what's actually in the law is impossible to provide. Just even with unlimited resources, it would be almost impossible to provide that level of specificity, have it updated on a monthly basis. You get into HIPAA concerns, all kinds of privacy issues when you get into that level of spending. And then, you know, with 553 municipalities and 100 counties and 115 school systems, to expect the state to somehow compile all that and make it consistent, unless they're going to provide funding for one sort of budgetary system or budget software that every single government has to use, I just don't even know how you would go about that. So yeah, one of those things that sort of got stuck in the budget last year, but what I've heard from the state is the same that you've heard from the state, that they're not expecting local governments to take any new action as a result of that. So I'm sorry, sir, yes.
That's okay. Speaking on that same line, so the redacting of personal, I guess you would call it, some personal information of local law enforcement officers out of, I think the definition was county databases.
Yes.
Anything on that, anything that's going to come out for, I guess, clarification on that you're aware of?
Did that end up passing last year?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I know there was talk about, I think this came out of that issue in Wake County where some a law enforcement officer's family was targeted for a kidnapping. And so, yeah, there was this move to any local law enforcement officer who wanted to be removed from county database could. I haven't heard anything about it since last session. So if there's more clarification on what that means coming, I haven't heard anything about it. I haven't heard it come up this year. But if you need, I can check with the counties on that, but I have not heard any discussion of it since last session. Yes?
For the 2013 law about all learning material going digital by 2017, is there any, I know DPI is throwing out that they pass on numbers, budgetary numbers that they're sending to the legislature to fund that. Is there anything specific brought up about that? About whether there's going to be some, whether they're making a commitment to the funding to do that because they have to meet the 2017 law, or is it just another one of those things that, oh yeah, we passed it?
I guess my short answer is I don't know. My long answer is, you know, as I always am grateful to the county that I don't have to be the one that deals with education issues because it's so controversial and is so much goes into it. I have not heard of, in all the, you know, I did a lot of reading of the budget itself and the budget summaries and everything that's in there. I did not come across anything about funding for digital textbooks in what I read. So you might be right. It could be another one of those items that is just out there but not necessarily funded. But if I hear anything different, I'll certainly let you know. Anything else? Well, I hope you won't begrudge me if I let you out a little bit early. But I appreciate y'all giving me the opportunity to come down here and coming to this session this afternoon. And if you need anything or have any questions about anything else, just I'll be around for a little bit afterwards. Feel free to send me an email or give me a call. But thank you very much for having me.